Hello, everyone. Hello, Politicos. Hello, Jason Isaacs. Hello, everybody else who wants to know a little bit about socialism. Now, this, as you can see, there is my second go at socialism. I think that these videos will work best if you use them in conjunction with my other vids, largely because the other ones have lots of content on them. But what these ones are designed to do is to help you answer a question as directly and as efficiently as possible. And what we're going to do is we're going to follow a broadly similar structure through socialism, all three different streams of socialism, so that you can take the ideas consistently from one idea to the next. And in that, I think it's quite important to remember that most ideologies will be a reaction to previous ideologies. So if you want to start with liberalism, because that was the great Enlightenment, the great Enlightenment ideology, that was supersede, or rather conservatism can be seen to a certain extent as a reaction to liberalism, and socialism as a reaction to conservatism. And within each ideology, each different stream of ideology tends to emerge as an answer to the problems that were left unsolved by the first one. So we're going to start off with revolutionary socialism, then we're going to look at democratic socialism and the way in which democratic socialism tried to answer the questions raised in revolutionary socialism, and then finally the third way and the way that that sort of sits on top of all the other ones. But we're going to start by looking at the context, and the context of revolutionary socialism is looking at human nature and saying, well, hang on a second. If humanity is perfectible, if humanity is this pure idea of empathy, then how is it that we're in such a mess? And the answer to that is that we're corrupted, or we're degraded by capitalism, and that induces within us a false consciousness, be that either materialism or indeed trade union consciousness, the idea that we will find happiness through the purchase and consumption of goods, or that we are somehow benefiting from our oppression, as Lenin would have argued. Anyway, that's that. And society, we're looking again at a post-industrial society, and one which is beset with class divisions. The proletariat, which we all know about, they work but they don't own capital, they don't own the factories in which they work, and the bourgeoisie, who own the factories but don't actually work in them. And Marx argued that those two would be always in opposition, and that all suffering in society arose as a consequence of that class distinction. Our economy is controlled by the capitalists, and capitalism in this sense is, whoever dies with the most toys wins. The bourgeoisie, obviously, they gain the most because they can exploit the workers for their own ends. And the whole of society, the whole of capitalism, is organized around the production of wealth. And the harder the workers work, the wealthier the owners get. And that, of course, is the root of political consciousness that then seeks into all of the other ideology, all of the other stages that lead inevitably to revolution, as far as revolutionary Marxists is concerned. The state is very much controlled by those who control the capital, and it's run in the interest, therefore, of those who own the capital. And the mechanisms of change, that is, the elections, are effectively controlled by the bourgeoisie, and so change has to come from outside the system that we're looking at, hence the whole idea of revolution. But that's the context. Let's do a little bit let's dig into that in a little more detail. And what we're going to do here, and this is why I think this method is particularly helpful, is that we're always going to start with human nature, and then society and the economy will be downstream ideas of human nature, but they will be driven largely by the ideas controlled within that human nature. And the state, the role of the state is going to be, again, to a certain extent, determined by the shape of society, the shape of the economy, and the way in which those are themselves informed by human nature. That possibly sounds a little bit confusing, but hopefully as we go into this, you'll see exactly where we are. So let's kick off with our revolutionary socialist, and the starting point being the human condition. And as we said earlier, it's empathetic. We are born into this network of individuals. We are naturally inclined towards empathy. We are naturally inclined to be sociable, and that's just the definition of Wikipedia, of empathy. That is the natural state. Now, where do you get that from? Well, basically, you pull it out of the air. This was an observation made by Marx and various other theorists at the time, looking at the way in which animals worked in natural state, looking at the way in which the family worked, and extrapolating from that to what might be said of a wider social model. So very, very simple there. Human nature is empathetic. We are born into this society with a natural state of empathy. And that has consequences as we go downstream. It has consequences for our society and it has consequences for our economy. And we're going to start off by going into this notion of society. And the key phrase that I use here all the time is this idea of the empathetic collective. Now, what does that mean? It means that it's inevitable. We're born into society. We can't extract ourselves from society. We're naturally born into a unit. There may be a functional unit, it may be a dysfunctional unit, but we're born into a social network that exists. And so it's argued that society is the natural state of human. You can't have a human without a sort of social structure around it. You must at some point have had a mother and a father, and originally that would have been how it was, and whatever happens after that has happened after that. But you are born into a human network. And when we're born, we're class free. Everyone is born with equal moral value. Everyone is born with equal moral worth. Nobody is born worth more than somebody else. Again, here we're rejecting, obviously, ideas of natural hierarchy and all that sort of stuff. Certainly rejecting ideas of the monarchy. Everyone is born with equal moral value. And if we can do that, if we can eradicate all of these aftermarket distinctions, then we can bring ourselves back to this pre-lapse state, to this utopian state, and eradicate class distinction. You eradicate all forms of human suffering. But again, this is all a consequence of the empathy. Empathy is what we're naturally inclined towards, but something has got in the way. Our social model, therefore, is a Gemeinschaft. The links between the individuals are not rational. They're not contractual. They are very much inevitable, natural, part of the human condition. You can't extract the society from the human. You can't extract the human from society. So it's a Gemeinschaft. These are sustained by empathy, these entities. And this is the critical thing. If we have a society that is based on empathy, then that society necessarily must be self-regulating. It adjusts automatically. There's no exploitation. There's no crime. There's nothing to be gained by exploiting everybody else, because we're all feeling this empathy. So in your empathetic collective, it's self-regulating, and it should be evident from that we're going to have consequences downstream of this for society. If our society is self-regulating, then what exactly do we need the state for? If we're able to moderate our behavior because we are working within this empathetic collective, then that is going to have profound consequences for the role of the state. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself, but remember that, because that's going to come up again when we come to look at the economy. So within society, then we have the empathetic collective, where it is a self-regulating model because all of the individuals in it are empathetic and friendly and and inclined towards community and sociability. So no one's seeking to beat each other, no one's seeking to cheat each other, because we're all sustained by empathy. And if we cheat somebody, then we feel that pain. Now, the economy in this particular model becomes a means of allocating scarce resources, which, in case you're wondering, is the general definition of economy. But again, because we're looking at a system whereby we have broken down the divisions of class, where we have broken down the ownership of capital, and now everybody owns everything. If the workers own the means of production, then the workers are the owners, and the workers and the owners and the workers are the owners. So no one's going to exploit anybody. Because we're all on the same level. There's no way in which the owners can exploit the workers, because they're exactly the same people. So they would gain nothing by exploiting themselves. So by eradicating the distinction of class ownership, by eradicating the capital, dissolving the distinction between the capital earning classes and the working classes, then we eradicate all forms of conflict, because one person can't essentially declare war on himself. Again, the critical point here that they're arguing is that you can't reallocate by taking a little bit from you and giving it to them, and taking a little bit from somebody else and giving that to somebody else. You can never square the circle that way. What you have to do is you have to cut the Gordian knot. And the only way of equitably distributing capital is to dissolve ownership of capital. And so everybody owns everything. And if the workers are the owners and the owners are the workers, then nobody's going to exploit anybody either. From which it follows that we've got obviously an organization around needs rather than wants, because no one's inclined to exploit anybody for profit. But critically, this also becomes self-regulating then. If no one's exploiting anybody, if no one's cheating anybody, then this economy becomes self-regulating. There's no need for the state to step in and say, right, you can do this and you can do that because we need to balance this out. Rather, because we're working on these empathetic grounds where the workers are the owners and the owners are the workers, then no one's exploiting anybody, nobody's cheating, nobody's forcing anybody to work harder than they want to. And therefore, this model is self-regulating, from which, again, this has profound consequences for the role of the state. So our economy is based around the collective ownership of capital. The workers can't exploit the owners. Sorry, the owners can't exploit the workers, because they're effectively the same people. And we have an economy organized around needs rather than wants. That idea from each, according to their ability, to each according to their need. Now, if we've got a society that's running along the grounds of the empathetic collective, and if we've got an economy that's recognizing the collective ownership of capital, then the role of the state essentially becomes, or rather, that there is no role for the state. Now, there is a transitional role as we move from the capitalist society to the socialist society. And that is this transitional one where we seek to re-engineer both the society and the economy to meet our socialist ends. So we have our dictatorship of the proletariat, and they engineer the collective ownership of capital, and they rip out class distinctions to ensure that we have a flat society. Then society becomes self-regulating, it's classless, we're operating along the grounds of the empathetic collective. The economy is self-regulating because the workers are the owners and the owners are the workers. So that means the state is redundant. The state has nothing to do. The state essentially, as Engels said, becomes an administration of things rather than the government of persons. So that was Engels writing in 1877. We get to this point where the state withers away because these two things are self-regulating. You don't need the state to come in and impose order on society because we've eradicated class distinctions, and all strife is a consequence of class distinction. We don't need the state to come in and regulate the economy because we've got a collective ownership of capital. So the owners are the workers and the workers are the owners, and no one's exploiting anybody. And all of this stems from the concept of the empathetic human, whereby our natural state is inclined towards empathy, inclined towards helping one another, not exploiting one another, but rather working in a sense of community and fraternity and sorority and sociability and all of these other words, because we've managed to eradicate our addiction to capitalism, to materialism. We've shaken off our false consciousness, both capitalism and the trade union consciousness, that we can somehow profit from the workers can somehow be profiting as much as the owners in any capitalist society. And that's about it, really. So the state withers away. We're left with the self-regulating society. We're left with the self-regulating economy, because both of them are based on an empathetic human. The state's job is done. Thank you very much. It withers away, and everyone's happy. Except it didn't happen. And the reason why it doesn't happen is because empathy only stretches so far. You can have a society based on empathy. That's going to run out at about 120 individuals. After that, you move from a society where the empathy is essentially a bureaucratic organization. And if you have a bureaucratic organization instead of empathy, then the state's never going to wither away, because that empathy never really kicks in. Instead, you have bureaucracy. And so that's essentially one of the reasons why the Soviet Union failed. The other being that once you've given somebody a vast amount of power, it's kind of hard to take it out of their hands. They tend not to like it. And we're done. How long was that? That wasn't too bad. We're going to come back next with democratic socialism. We're going to follow that same structure. We're going to start with the human nature, follow that one through, see where it gets us to, and what that tells us about society, the economy, and what they tell us about the state. And we're done. Thank you very much. I shall see you all very, very soon. I'm sure. Cheers now.